Good afternoon. What I wanted to do today was to go over the first two paragraphs. We're working on our assessment essay for the summer, and I would say about a half of you have had a good go at producing your first draft of your introduction and first paragraph. And for some reason, unbeknown to me, the rest of you haven't. And maybe this is because you've been catching up on previous work, or because you've just been computer gaming and not concentrating in the lesson. But I want you to have a really good go this lesson at giving me something to comment on. Right? It doesn't have to be the finished article. This is like a poem. It will go through several redrafts before you get there. Our purpose this year in this course is to teach you how to write a good persuasive essay. Right? You need the tools of analysis and evaluation, of putting an argument, having a counter argument, and having a reply. And that's a difficult, very sophisticated essay technique to develop, but it's useful in English, geography, history, religious studies, all of the humanities, to have that skill. And it's a really important skill for life, to be able to gather information where there's an element of controversy, and to take a view that's reasoned and evidenced and persuade people of it. So this is a life skill, and that's why you should work at it. And I'm not commenting in terms of grading or marks on your work at this stage. I'm just giving you feedback about how to improve it. So meet me halfway, do your best, try and produce a good introductory paragraph and a good first paragraph, and then I can give you some feedback and we can improve. We can get better and better, and then we'll be ready for you to do your summer exam on this essay. So what do you have to do in an introductory paragraph? Three things really. So you've got to unpack the question, right? What precisely are the words in the question asking of you? What opinion will emerge will depend upon how you read the question. You can go completely off at a tangent. In fact, the number one reason students at A-level underperform in exams is because they misread the question and they don't interpret the wording of the question. They go off at a tangent and write something that's irrelevant. It's not that they don't know what they're talking about, it's just they've not read the question carefully. So you need to unpack the question. You need to define your terms very carefully. And then finally, you need to take a position on the question, have an opinion, and say why. We're not interested in what you think, we're interested in why, the reasons you have for thinking it, and the reasons why you've rejected the counter argument, the alternative position. So let's go into this question. Should we believe in God? Well, it doesn't say, is there a God, right? That would be a yes-no question. It says, should we believe in God? And if you remember Pascal says this is a forced choice. In other words, we don't necessarily have sufficient evidence. Now, there are philosophers, W.K. Clifford is one of them, who says that you should hold no belief without sufficient evidence. If you don't have sufficient evidence, you shouldn't hold that belief. But sometimes we have to take a position on an issue that we don't know everything about. So take coronavirus. Public health officials have never really had to deal with an issue of this kind of scale before, and we don't have all of the data about it. So, but we've got to act. It might turn out in hindsight that some countries handled it better than others, and that there was a right way to administer resources and to deal and tackle with this crisis. But we don't know that yet fully. So we have a forced choice. We have to make a decision when we're not in possession of the full evidence. And you might say that belief in God is like that. You've got to kind of act with your time, your money, and your beliefs in one way or another. Either there is a God or there's not a God. You've got to live practically as that. Now, agnostics would say, no, you can sit on the fence. You can say, until there's sufficient evidence, I don't need to take a position. And it's interesting that Dawkins says we're all atheists about most, maybe 99% of the gods that humanity has ever believed in. Some of us just go one god further. Right? No one's believing in Thor or Zeus or Poseidon these days. You know, sailors don't pray to Poseidon like they might once have done. So, you know, just one god further. So that's an interesting question. When we define God, this question will come up again. Who do we mean? I mean, there are lots of gods, plural. We've had pantheons of Roman gods and Greek gods and Norse gods. So how do we come to monotheism, to one God? Well, in this course, we've generally been talking about the God of classical theism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and Sikhism. You could broaden that out beyond that, but this is a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, a creator of the universe, one who's self-caused and the origin of all things, and is monotheistic, one God. So that's generally what all of these philosophers we've been looking at in the Western tradition, people like Augustine, Irenaeus, Pascal, Aquinas, they've all been talking about the God of classical theism. Either that God exists or it doesn't. And that's because in Western philosophy, really from the time of Plato, that's the way we've looked at God. You could take issue with that, but if you decide on that definition, then it's easier to come to a conclusion. If you complicate things and say, well, we could have many pictures of gods, it's more hard to come to a conclusion. And you need to take a position. And if you have time, you might not, but if you have, say which arguments have persuaded you to take your view. So in this essay, I'm going to argue that the design argument, the causal argument, the defense against the problem of evil have persuaded me that God exists. Or in this essay, I'm going to be arguing that the problem of evil, the evolution and the implausibility of religious explanations for the origin of the universe have led me to believe that there isn't a God, and the arguments for the existence of God, the design argument, the causal argument, I just don't find persuasive. We don't need to go into detail, just give a kind of hint about where you're going in the essay. Now, here's an example of a first paragraph. It's long, but it's got a counter argument and a reply. Counter arguments are your friends because they show an awareness of alternative views and your response to them. So if I just read it through, the moral argument for God's existence states that without a moral lawgiver, morality is subjective, a matter of personal taste and opinion without solid foundation. One person might think lying is okay if you can get away with it. Another thinks it's absolutely wrong and always your duty to tell the truth. It's not just that God's will is said to be revealed in the 10 Commandments of Scripture, for instance. It's also built into or innate within people's consciences. Their duty and their sense of shame and guilt is believed to be a moral law written into the natural order. Counter-argument. Of course, many see the moral argument against God's existence as being more powerful. Charles Darwin saw evolution, a competition for survival, which had brought thousands of years of suffering and death. He concluded that this is more likely to be the result of blind and pitiless forces in natural selection than some supernatural force at work to produce what Leibniz called the best of all possible worlds. The problem with natural evil really came home to Darwin personally with the death of his daughter Annie, which caused him to lose his faith in God. John Stuart Mill also saw the suffering of the world, both of humans and animals, as he writes of natural evil, human anarchy and the reign of terror. That's the French Revolution, where, do you remember, they killed all the aristocrats, the wealthy and powerful people in French society, and executed them by the guillotine. These are overmatched. In other words, that they're outshone or a worse example of suffering is the injustice, ruin, and death by hurricane and pestilence. In other words, natural evil in the world does a worse job. I mean, it kills more people than human wars. In other words, nature can exceed what human evil is capable of in the suffering it inflicts through disease and natural disaster. Therefore, there can't be a God. In response to this view, Mill seems to have ignored the free will defense that God could only have created a world with love and sacrifice, compassion and courage if people's choices had serious consequences. A world which evolves itself and in which humans have a great deal of responsibility can be argued to be preferable to a magical world where God is undeniably evident at every moment but overrides human free will or the laws of nature to prevent all suffering. In other words, God is always intervening in this world to stop suffering, and it's a kind of magical world where if people fall off building, God suspends gravity and they land like feathers on the ground. Furthermore, without plate tectonics, which creates earthquakes, the world would have no breathable atmosphere, so it couldn't support life. Without mutations that cause disease, there would be no evolution. So improvements might make things worse. So I would therefore conclude that with Augustine's free will defense and Irenaeus' sense that we can often grow through some kinds of suffering, and that maybe God built the world for moral growth of souls and for happiness, not in this lifetime, but the next, that there is a God. So that's what I'm looking for, okay? You don't necessarily need to make it this long, but you do need to mention some scholars, John Stuart Mill, Darwin, Leibniz. You need to mention some of their arguments. And if you put up a counter argument, you need to reply to it. You need counter arguments to get a sense of argument, counter argument, reply, which is what being a philosopher is all about. Not just monologue, but dialogue, listening to counter arguments, taking on board those that are good and responding. Now, you might conclude, I'm going to sit on the fence. I'm an agnostic. There's not evidence sufficient either way, and therefore that's my view. I mean, you've got to deal with the criticism of Pascal at that point, who says that's not an option. You're practically living as an atheist. You know, you're not committing your time and energies to the worship of God, and therefore you're practically living as an atheist. But for someone like Russell, he would say, well, no, until there's evidence for something, you are not obliged to believe in it. So that's what you've got to do. Unpack the question, define your terms, come up with a thesis statement, and that's your opening paragraph, your introduction. And your first paragraph, you've got to have an argument, a counter argument, and a reply. Right? So do your best this time. If you've already had a go at that, take on board my comments and this, and try and redraft a second time your introductory paragraph and your first paragraph. Okay? Do your best, and that will allow me to comment on what you've been writing. Okay, meet me halfway, do your best, and I will then give you some feedback on that.